Imagine stepping out onto a jagged, wind-scoured glacier.
Right. At like 14,000 feet up.
Exactly. The ambient temperature is well below freezing. The air is so incredibly thin, your lungs are just burning with every single breath. And the wind is howling through this gorge like a freight train.
I mean, it sounds completely miserable.
It is. Now look down at the uniform you've been issued for this environment. It is made of thin, summer cotton.
Oh, wow. Just cotton.
Just cotton. And you are holding a bolt-action Lee Enfield .303 rifle, which is a weapon that basically belongs in a museum display of the Second World War.
Right, yeah. A completely obsolete weapon for that setting.
Yeah, and you reach into your ammunition pouch and you count exactly 50 bullets.
50?
50. That is all you have. There are no reinforcements. Your radio battery is dead from the cold, and the enemy is sitting on the ridge right above you, just watching your every move.
You know, it sounds like the premise of some kind of psychological horror film.
It really does.
But that was the waking, breathing reality for thousands of soldiers of the Indian Army in the autumn of 1962. I mean, we so often look at military history from the sanitized height of a general's map room.
Right, pushing little blocks around.
Exactly. We look at the sweeping blue and red arrows, the phase lines, all the strategic objectives. But war doesn't happen on a map.
No, it happens on the ground.
It happens in the mud, in the snow, and in that terrifying gap between what politicians command and what a military force can actually execute.
And that gap, that fatal, catastrophic canyon between political ambition and ground-level capability is exactly what we are dissecting today. So welcome back to the study table.
Yes, welcome back.
To you, the listener, who is returning for Module 2 of our 6-part analytical revision series on the Sino-Indian War of 1962. If you're joining us to build an advanced, rigorous understanding of this conflict, well, you are in the exact right place.
Definitely. This deep dive is built specifically to give you the analytical anchors you need for your exams and your general understanding.
Yeah, let's do a quick recall from our first module just to set the operational stage. We laid the foundation by looking at the high-level strategic assumptions.
Right, the political mindset.
We examined the forward policy, this audacious, maybe reckless idea from New Delhi of pushing isolated military outposts as close to the disputed border as possible.
Which was incredibly risky.
And we looked at the initial, really strained deployments into the unforgiving terrain of Tibet and the Himalayas.
Which sets the thematic anchor for today's analysis, really. We're calling it From Military Preparedness Gap to Collapse in NIFA.
NIFA being the Northeast Frontier Agency.
Right, what we know today as Arunachal Pradesh. And the guiding principle I want you to hold in your mind as we move through this data is this. War exposes the gap between political intention and military capability.
That's a great way to frame it.
Today, we are basically stepping into the role of senior military instructors conducting a post-action diagnostic.
Okay, I like that.
We're going to look at the mechanics of failure. You know, how does a seemingly powerful nation mandate a border defense strategy that just ends in total operational collapse?
Let's start with the tools of the trade then, the force level analysis.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, if you were going to order an army to execute a hypo-aggressive border policy, you really have to look at what that army is actually built to do.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You have to look at their actual capabilities.
Right. On paper, if I'm a politician in New Delhi in 1962, I look at my ledger and I see an army with 9 infantry divisions, armored division, an independent armored brigade, and a parachute brigade.
Which sounds pretty great.
It sounds like a formidable instrument of state power, right?
It is formidable, provided you are fighting the war that instrument was actually designed for. But the structural orientation of the Indian Army in 1962 was completely mismatched to the Himalayas. I mean, this was a plains-oriented army.
Built for flat ground.
Exactly. Its doctrine, its training, its equipment, and its entire logistical tail were all optimized to fight on the flat, dusty plains of Punjab and Rajasthan.
Because they were primarily focused on a theoretical threat from Pakistan, right?
Right. The bulk of their combat power was garrisoned in the West. But when you pivot to look at the Eastern Command, which was commanded by Lieutenant General L.P. Sen over in Lucknow, the geography alone is just overwhelming.
It's massive.
He is responsible for this incredibly rugged, porous border stretching from Sikkim and Bhutan all the way along the McMahon Line down to the Burmese border.
That is an impossible amount of territory.
It is. Beneath him is 33 Corps under Lieutenant General Umrao Singh, headquartered in Shillong. And then we have this sudden, highly irregular creation of 4 corps under Lieutenant General B.M. Call at Tezpur.
And that happened in October 1962, right as things were heating up.
Yeah, it was a command structure built on the fly in the middle of an escalating crisis.
I want to focus on the physical reality of the infantrymen for a second, because the contrast between the plains and the mountains isn't just about strategy, it's about the literal physics of combat.
Oh, absolutely. The environment is actively trying to kill you.
We touched on the cotton uniforms in the intro. You have troops from these storied regiments like the 9 Punjab, the 19 Gorkha Rifles, and the 2 Rajput, and they are being ordered up into the high Himalayas in late October.
Right, as winter is setting in.
Yeah, and they are issued cotton shirts, a single olive green jersey, and 1 blanket.
1 blanket.
A single blanket. When night temperatures are dropping to minus 10 degrees Celsius, how does that even happen?
It comes down to systemic logistical paralysis. The Indian military had been starved of modernization capital for a decade.
Right, because of the post-colonial economic situation.
Exactly. India was navigating this really complex post-colonial non-aligned policy. They didn't have the hard foreign currency reserves to just, buy modern weapons on the open market.
So they couldn't just call up the U.S. or the U.K. and place an order.
Well, purchasing from the West risked upsetting the delicate geopolitical balance with Pakistan, while turning to the Soviet Union risked antagonizing the very Chinese forces massing on the border.
Talk about being caught between a rock and a hard place.
Yeah, so they relied on domestic defense production, which was just entirely inadequate for outfitting a mountain army. Look at the weaponry. The standard issue is the bolt-action Lee-Enfield .303.
Which is, that's a trench gun from World War I, basically.
It is. It's a weapon designed for the trenches of the First and Second World Wars. It is heavy. The bolt mechanism becomes super sluggish in extreme cold because the grease literally freezes inside the gun.
Oh, wow. I didn't even think about the grease freezing.
Yeah, and its rate of fire is entirely dependent on the physical dexterity of a soldier whose fingers are actively suffering from frostbite.
That's horrifying.
And then there is the ammunition constraint. A soldier going into battle with 50 rounds in his pouches.
Let's do the math on that. If you were in a sustained firefight, laying down suppressive fire, or repelling a human wave assault, how long does 50 rounds of .303 ammunition actually last?
Well, in high-intensity combat, an infantryman will exhaust 50 rounds in approximately 30 minutes.
30 minutes.
Yeah. Once you hit the 31-minute mark, your primary weapon is effectively a very heavy wooden club with a bayonet attached to it.
That is it's a death sentence. And what about artillery, the big guns?
The supporting arms were under the exact same constraints. The 17 PRA field guns had a total firing capacity of about 420 rounds available. The heavy mortars had roughly 450 rounds.
That doesn't sound like a lot for an entire campaign.
It's nothing. For the listener constructing an analytical framework here, you have to understand that artillery is the spine of mountain defense. If you cannot sustain artillery fire, you cannot hold a mountain pass.
So how long could they shoot?
The Indian forces could sustain perhaps an hour of heavy bombardment before their guns just fell completely silent.
And even getting those meager supplies up to the troops was a logistical nightmare that feels almost, farcical. There are no motorable roads connecting these forward posts in Nifa to the plains.
Right, it's all just goat paths and vertical drops.
So the military is entirely reliant on airdrops. But dropping supplies into the Himalayas isn't like dropping supplies over Normandy.
No, the aerodynamics are completely different.
You have extreme wind shears, incredibly narrow gorges, and sudden weather shifts. The data shows a recovery rate of a mere 30%.
30%. I want you to think about the mechanical inefficiency of that system. It is like trying to restock a skyscraper by throwing groceries out of a helicopter onto a narrow balcony in a hurricane.
That is a brilliant analogy.
Yeah.
And a terrible reality.
70% of the survival gear, the ammunition, and the food is either bouncing off jagged cliffs, plummeting into inaccessible ravines, or literally drifting on the wind into Chinese-held territory.
So they're effectively resupplying the enemy with some of these drops.
Sometimes, yes. The Indian Air Force was operating these unpressurized C-119 packets in Dakotas, pushing these aircraft and pilots to their absolute physical limits.
The pilots were doing everything they could.
Everything. But the terrain simply defeated the method of delivery.
There is a detail from the sources that just stops you in your tracks. It's about the food.
Oh, the lentils.
The lentils. The standard Indian army ration is based on a high-calorie plains diet, heavily reliant on lentils. But anyone who has ever boiled water in the mountains knows that as you gain altitude, the atmospheric pressure drops and water boils at a much lower temperature.
Right, at 14,000 feet, water boils at roughly 85 degrees Celsius.
Which is not hot enough to break down the cellular structure of a lentil.
Not even close.
Exactly. You could boil them all day, and you just end up with hot pebbles. So the frontline commanders urgently requested pressure cookers.
Which makes perfect sense.
It is a vital piece of survival equipment. But the shipments were held up by what the reports vaguely term administrative delays.
And that phrase just represents the complete disconnect between the bureaucratic machinery in the capital and the survival mechanics of the front line.
Some clerk in an office somewhere.
Exactly. An administrative clerk in New Delhi sees a requisition for pressure cookers and classifies it as a low-priority kitchen supply. They utterly fail to comprehend that at 14,000 feet, a pressure cooker is a tactical asset.
It's life or death.
Without it, you are systematically starving your own infantry. Oil cookers, which were essential for both melting snow for drinking water and preventing frostbite in the bunkers, were similarly held up.
So you have a soldier who is freezing in cotton, holding 30 minutes of ammunition, and he hasn't had a hot meal in days.
Yeah.
How does the military leadership allow this to happen? I mean, why isn't military intelligence screaming at the politicians to pull these troops back?
Because military intelligence had been systematically blinded and sidelined.
Sidelined how?
Well, the Indian military did not possess an independent external intelligence gathering apparatus. They were entirely dependent on the Civilian Intelligence Bureau, the IB, which was directed by B.N. Mullick.
And what were they looking at?
Almost nothing. The IB had almost zero physical human intelligence assets operating on the ground inside Tibet.
Wait, zero? So they were just guessing?
They were drafting appraisals based on secondary intelligence fed to them by the CIA and British sources, and filtering it through a very specific political lens.
So they were telling the prime minister what he wanted to hear.
Precisely. The IB essentially created an echo chamber. A September 1961 intelligence appraisal confidently assured the government that the Chinese would not retaliate with military force if India pushed its outposts forward.
They thought it was all a bluff.
They operated on the assumption that China was bluffing, that they were absorbed by their own domestic crises like the Great Leap Forward, and that they would simply issue diplomatic protests and back down.
That is an incredibly dangerous assumption to make.
It was. The civilian intelligence apparatus was effectively dictating tactical military policy, treating a heavily armed border dispute as though it were a routine police action.
Okay, let's pivot the lens and look at the adversary. What does the Chinese People's Liberation Army, the PLA, bring to this exact same geographical space? Because it is a stark, almost terrifying contrast.
Yeah. It is the difference between an amateur expedition and a hardened military machine operating in its element.
What were their numbers like?
The PLA deployed 8 divisions along the frontiers, with an additional 4 divisions held in immediate reserve.
That's massive.
And you have to look at the composition of these troops. These were not plainsmen drafted into the mountains. These were combat veterans who had fought the Americans in the freezing conditions of the Korean War.
So they knew cold.
They knew extreme cold. And they had spent the preceding years conducting brutal, high-altitude anti-insurgency operations against the Khampa resistance in Tibet.
So they were already up there fighting and living in the altitude.
Fully acclimatized, physically hardened, and equipped with padded winter gear and automatic weapons like the PPS-41 submachine gun.
An automatic weapon versus a bolt-action rifle with frozen grease.
Exactly. And their logistical approach was entirely different. They weren't trying to drop crates out of airplanes.
What were they doing instead?
They altered the geography. While India was losing 70% of its airdrops, the Chinese Engineering Corps had systematically built a 7-ton motorable road that reached all the way to Marmaing.
A road, all the way to the front.
Yes, Marmaing was a staging area just a few hours' march from the Thagla Ridge. From the roadheads, they utilized thousands of local Tibetan porters and incredibly sturdy Tibetan ponies to move supplies to massive forward dumps at Lo, Marmaing, and Sonazong.
That is just... The preparation is staggering. They were even laying physical telephone lines right up to their forward trenches, so they weren't relying on spotty, battery-draining radio sets.
Yes, hard lines right to the front.
They had interpreters at the front who spoke major Indian languages.
If you are synthesizing this for an analytical framework, call it the capability, limitation, and battlefield effect chain, the contrast is absolute.
Let's break that down for the listener.
Sure. The Chinese capability. Localized numerical superiority, acclimatized veterans, and a continuous road-linked logistical spine terminating directly at the theater of operations.
Right. And the India limitation.
World War II weaponry, cotton clothing, unacclimatized troops, and a severed supply chain relying on high-attrition airdrops.
Which leads to the final link in the chain, the battlefield effect.
Exactly, the battlefield effect. The PLA possesses the mechanical capability to sustain high-intensity combat operations in sub-zero temperatures indefinitely. The Indian Army possesses the capability to fight for approximately 30 minutes before succumbing to ammunition depletion and environmental exposure.
Which brings us to the most baffling question of this entire conflict. If the military commanders on the ground knew this, and we know they did, they were sending reports back, why did the political leadership in New Delhi decide to actively provoke a confrontation at a place called Thagla?
It makes no logical sense from a military standpoint.
Why push a brittle, starving army into an aggressive posture?
To understand the mechanism of that disastrous decision, we have to examine Operation Leghorn and the detonator that was the Dola Post crisis.
The Dola Post, what happened there?
On June 4th, 1962, an Indian platoon from the Assam Rifles advanced and established a post on the southern bank of the Namka Chu River. They named it Dola Post.
Okay, so they set up camp.
But the catastrophic error here, born of incredibly poor topographical intelligence, was that based on map coordinates, this post was actually located north of the McMahon Line.
Wait, I need to pause here. You are saying the Indian military established a forward operating base in territory that even their own maps, if read correctly, showed as disputed or belonging to the Chinese side of the line.
Yes.
How does a mistake of that magnitude happen?
You have to understand how these boundaries were drawn back in the day. The McMahon Line was a thick, hand-drawn line on a small-scale, rudimentary map from 1914.
Just a literal pen mark on paper.
Right. When you take a thick pen stroke on a small-scale map and project it onto the actual three-dimensional topography of the Himalayas, that line covers miles of rugged terrain.
Oh, I see.
The local commander on the ground looked at the topography and established the post north of the map's line because he felt it offered a better tactical position.
He was looking at the ground, not the politics.
Exactly. But politically, it was a colossal unforced error. Up until that moment, the Chinese forces had generally remained north of the towering Thagla Ridge. But the establishment of the Dola Post provided Beijing with the perfect, legally defensible provocation.
They gave them an excuse.
On September 8th, the PLA moved down from the ridge and surrounded the Dola Post. They did not attack immediately. They simply took up dominating positions on the high ground, looking down into the Indian perimeter.
They are turning up the heat, basically waiting to see how New Delhi reacts.
Yes.
And the reaction from the Indian capital is the launch of Operation Leghorn.
Right. On September 9th, a critical meeting takes place in Delhi. Defense Minister V.K. Krishna Menon, alongside the Chief of Army Staff, General P.N. Thapar, and other senior political and military figures, make a fateful decision.
And what do they decide?
Driven by domestic political pressure and the media outcry over Chinese incursions, they order the military to evict the Chinese forces from south of the Thagla Ridge. Force is authorized. The operation is codenamed Leghorn.
I look at the logistics of this order, and my mind just rejects it. They task the 7th Infantry Brigade to execute this eviction.
Yes, under Brigadier John Delvey.
Now, 7th Brigade is stationed hundreds of kilometers away. Their primary mission is to defend Tawang, right?
Yeah.
Which is a massive, strategically vital monastic town.
A huge cultural and tactical objective.
But Delhi orders them to abandon their prepared defenses, march over rugged terrain to the Namka Chu Valley, and push the Chinese off a mountain.
It is the ultimate manifestation of the mission versus resources mismatch. Think about the spatial reality here.
Let's hear it.
A standard infantry brigade like the 7th, given its equipment constraints, is doctrinally capable of defending a linear front of perhaps 300 to 500 yards effectively.
300 to 500 yards.
Okay. Army headquarters in Delhi issues an order expecting them to clear and hold a front stretching 12,000 yards.
12,000 yards. That is almost 7 miles.
It's absurd.
You are asking a few battalions of men with bolt-action rifles, possessing zero artillery cover, to spread themselves across 7 miles of a river gorge and attack uphill against entrenched automatic weapons.
And the professional military men on the ground refuse to accept the delusion.
They push back.
Strongly. Lieutenant General Umrao Singh, the 33 Corps commander, forcefully pushed back against Delhi. He explicitly stated that executing an eviction order without a massive, months-long logistical buildup of roads and artillery was military suicide.
Any others?
Major General Niranjan Prasad, commanding the 4 Infantry Division, protested. Brigadier Dalvi protested from the front lines. They all said the exact same thing. The math does not work.
So what is the mechanism of failure here? When your corps commander, your division commander, and your brigade commander all tell you an order is suicidal, how does the system bypass them?
The political leadership bypasses them by decapitating the dissenting command structure.
Wow.
New Delhi effectively sidelines Bimrao Singh. They carve out a brand new, geographically nonsensical command called 4 Corps, and they place Lieutenant General B.M. Kaul in charge.
General Kaul. He is a fascinating and really tragic figure in this narrative. From the sources, it seems he was essentially a political general.
Yes, that's a fair assessment.
He had a background in the Supply Corps. He was personally very close to Prime Minister Nehru and Defense Minister Menon, but he lacked actual combat command experience at the division or corps level.
He was a facilitator, an ambitious officer who understood the political currents of New Delhi far better than he understood mountain warfare. Kaul flies into the theater, physically bypassing the established chain of command.
Just ignores them.
He ignores General Prasad and Brigadier Dalvi, and he begins issuing tactical orders directly to battalion commanders on the ground.
Which is a huge breach of protocol.
Massive. Now, Kaul realizes almost immediately upon seeing the terrain that a frontal assault up the Thagla Ridge is impossible.
Because it's practically a cliff face, right?
Right. But he is under immense pressure from Delhi to do something. So he invents a tactical concept he calls positional warfare.
Positional warfare. This is the idea of moving troops around like pieces on a chessboard without intending to actually fight, right?
Exactly.
It feels like trying to win a fist fight through interpretive dance.
It is a profound misunderstanding of the enemy's intent. Kaul's plan was to stealthily move a single Indian battalion behind the Chinese positions, specifically to occupy a geographical feature called Yamsola.
And what was the point of that?
His logic was purely theatrical. He believed that by placing Indian troops in the Chinese rear, he could report to Delhi that aggressive action had been taken, and he assumed the Chinese, realizing they were flanked, would simply abandon the Thagla Ridge without firing a single shot.
It's the intelligence echo chamber at work again. He is still operating on the IB's assumption that the Chinese are just bluffing. It's like moving a pawn deep into enemy territory, completely unsupported, and genuinely believing it's going to terrify the opponent's queen into retreating.
That's a great way to put it. And here is a crucial analytical anchor for you to note, listener. Objective without capability creates operational risk.
Say that again.
Objective without capability creates operational risk. When a government mandates a rigid political objective like evict the Chinese, but fundamentally refuses to supply the military capability required to achieve it, like artillery, winter gear, sustained logistics, it is not formulating a strategy. It is drafting a casualty list.
Which accelerates us directly into the tragedy of the Battle of Namka Chu.
Yes, the breaking point.
The operational risk we just discussed transforms into actual slaughter when you place troops in indefensible terrain to satisfy a political directive.
I was reading the topographical layout of the 7 brigades deployment, and it is just bewildering.
It defies all military logic. It's like being tasked to defend a massive fortress. But instead of manning the high stone battlements, your commander orders you to stand at the bottom of the moat while the enemy aims their bows down at you. Why were these troops strung out along the very floor of the river valley?
Because of the political obsession with the map line. The Namka Chu River had become the de facto boundary line in the minds of the politicians.
So they had to hold the line at all costs.
The directive was to not cede a single inch of territory. Tactically, the obvious move would be to pull 7 Brigade back from the river floor and place them on the high ground behind the river, the Sangdar Ridge.
Right, get above them.
From there, they would have fields of fire, defensive depth, and a better angle to receive airdrops. But General Kaul ordered them to hold the river line. So Brigadier Dalvi's forces were forced to string themselves out in isolated penny packets along the riverbanks, specifically guarding crossing points designated as bridges the 1st, 2, 3rd, 4, and V.
And we use the term bridges, but, these aren't concrete spans, are they?
No, not at all.
These are essentially just logs lashed together over a freezing, fast-moving mountain river.
That's all they were.
And directly above them looms the massive Phagla Ridge, swarming with Chinese troops who are looking right down the throats of the Indian defenses.
Let's explicitly outline the violation of mountain warfare principles here, because it represents a total collapse of operational art.
Okay, let's go through them.
First, the failure to hold the heights. In mountain warfare, gravity is the ultimate weapon. Whoever holds the high ground dictates the terms of the engagement. The PLA held Phaglo. Second, linear deployment with zero depth. The Indian troops were spread in a thin, fragile line along miles of river. If the Chinese pierced that line at any single point, the entire defensive structure would shatter because there was no secondary line behind it.
It's like a pane of glass.
Exactly. Third, the absence of reserves. Because the line was so absurdly long, every available man was pushed to the front. There was no reserve force held back to plug a gap or launch a counterattack.
And the fourth?
Fourth, exposed flanks. The terrain was so vast that there was actually a 9-kilometer undefended gap between some of the westernmost Indian positions.
9 kilometers. The Chinese commanders must have looked down from that ridge and realized the Indian army had completely trapped itself.
They did. The PLA operations were guided by the strategic doctrine of Marshal Lu Bocheng.
What was his plan?
He assessed the Indian deployment and issued a directive. The PLA must not engage in slow, grinding infiltration. They needed to attack with overwhelming ferocity to kill, wound, and capture the regulars in front of them.
A quick, brutal strike.
He used a very visceral anatomical analogy. He ordered his commanders to smash the head, cut the tail, snap the waist, dissect the belly.
Dissect the belly. It is a strategy of total anatomical dismemberment of the enemy force. How did they execute the setup for this attack without the Indian forces noticing the buildup?
Through masterful use of the terrain and night infiltration, the PLA recognized that they were facing regular Indian infantry, not border police, so they committed their crack assault troop.
Their best men.
Yes. Over the nights of October 17th, 18th, and 19th, while the Indian troops huddled in their open trenches trying not to freeze to death, Chinese advance units silently crossed the fordable sections of the Namka Chu River.
They just waded across in the dark.
They did. They utilized the re-entrance, the deep folds and ravines in the mountain slopes, to mask their movement. They physically walked past the linear Indian defenses in the dark, creeping into the dense jungle right behind the Indian bunkers.
So the Indian forces are meticulously facing forward, aiming their rifles at the river and the ridge across it, completely unaware that the Chinese are already sitting in the brush behind them, just waiting for the signal.
It was a textbook tactical envelopment. The Chinese plan was designed to hit the Indian positions from the rear and the flanks simultaneously, instantly negating whatever meager frontal defenses the Indians had prepared.
And that brings us to the morning of October 20th, 1962.
The day it all broke.
It is 04.30 hours. The Indian troops perform their standard morning stand-to. The temperature is brutally cold, well below zero. The men are shivering in cotton, clutching freezing metal rifles. They wait in the dark. And then at exactly 05.14 hours, the Chinese artillery opens up.
It wasn't just a barrage, it was a synchronized annihilation.
They knew exactly where to aim.
The Chinese artillery did not have to search for targets because they had spent weeks mapping the exact coordinates of every single Indian trench from their vantage point on the ridge.
They could see everything.
The bombardment was immediately followed by massive infantry assaults in divisional strength. Remember the disparity we discussed. The Chinese held a 6-to-1 numerical advantage at the point of contact.
6-to-1.
They threw 2 full brigades directly into the Dola area, slamming into the Rajputs and the Gorkhas.
Now what about the supply lines?
Simultaneously, they dispatched another brigade to assault the Indian supply drop zone at Sangdar, instantly cutting off any hope of resupply, while fast-moving columns were sent to physically seal off the retreat routes down the valley.
I think it is incredibly important, as we analyze this systemic failure of higher command, to separate the decisions of the generals from the actions of the Jawans on the ground.
Absolutely.
Because the soldiers in those trenches fought with an almost incomprehensible level of ferocity.
That distinction is paramount. The tactical collapse was not due to a failure of courage, it was a failure of physics and command.
Right.
The Indian infantry fought in isolated, cut-off platoons. Their communication lines were instantly severed by the bombardment. They had no artillery covering fire.
They were completely on their own.
They fought until their 50 rounds of ammunition were exhausted, and when the bullets ran out, they fought hand-to-hand with bayonets and entrenching tools.
There was one specific account that I think embodies the tragedy and the heroism of Namka Chu. The story of Major B.K. Pant, commanding a company of the 2 Rajput Regiment.
Ah, yes. His stand is a harrowing testament to martial duty.
His company was hit by 3 successive waves of Chinese infantry. In the first assaults, Major Pant was severely wounded in the stomach.
Just brutal injuries.
Minutes later, he took a burst of fire that shattered his leg. He was bleeding out in the freezing mud, unable to even stand. But he refused to allow his men to fall back or surrender.
He kept leading them.
He propped himself up against a trench wall and continued to direct the defense, roaring over the gunfire, telling his men they must fight to the last man and the last round.
And the Chinese realized who he was.
Yeah, the Chinese assault commanders quickly realized that this one shattered officer was the psychological linchpin holding the entire Indian defensive pocket together. So they concentrated heavy machine gun fire specifically on his position.
What were his last words?
His last words to his troops before he was killed were, "Men of the Rajput Regiment, you were born to die for your country. God has selected this small river for which you must die. Stand up and fight like true Rajputs." And he died shouting the regimental battle cry, "Bajrang Bali Ki Jai."
The cost of that bravery was just total.
Yeah.
The 2 Rajput battalion was essentially wiped out of existence by 9:00 a.m. that same morning. Out of a total strength of 513 men, 282 were killed in action.
More than half.
81 were severely wounded and captured, and 90 unwounded men were taken prisoner. An annihilation rate of that magnitude, over 50% killed in a matter of hours, is rarely seen in modern warfare outside of, like, the Eastern Front in World War II.
Brigadier John Delvey, the commander who had spent weeks protesting these exact suicidal orders, was captured in the jungle trying to reorganize a retreat. In less than half a day, the 7th Infantry Brigade simply ceased to exist as a fighting force.
Which forces us to look at the immediate operational consequence, bringing us to the next phase of the collapse, the Battle of Bum La and the fall of Tawang.
Right, because the door was open.
Exactly. Because the 7th Brigade was erased at Namka Chu, the heavy wooden doors to Tawang were thrown wide open.
And this is where the cascading effect of bad strategy becomes agonizing to watch. Tawang wasn't just a point on a map, it was a massive monastic center, culturally and strategically vital.
Very important.
And Tawang was the original defensive objective that 7th Brigade had been trained and positioned to hold. But because Delhi pushed them 100 kilometers forward to play positional warfare in a river moat, Tawang was left completely exposed behind them.
It was guarded by only a single infantry battalion. When the Chinese columns advanced past the slaughter at Namka Chu, there was no cohesive, layered defensive structure left to slow them down.
What was the command doing?
The Indian command apparatus was completely paralyzed. General Kaul, who had initiated the positional warfare folly, had fallen severely ill with pulmonary edema and was evacuated back to New Delhi.
He left the theater.
Incredibly, he attempted to continue commanding the corps from his sickbed in the capital.
You can't command a mountain war from a bed in Delhi.
No, you can't. Meanwhile, General Naranjan Prasad, the division commander, was cut off in the jungle, evading capture and trying to physically walk back to Tawang.
The command structure is literally wandering in the woods or lying in a hospital bed. So what happens when the Chinese arrive at Tawang?
The only viable option left is a forced, chaotic withdrawal.
They just leave.
The local commanders realized that without prepared defensive perimeters, without the artillery that had been left stuck down in the plains due to lack of roads, and with zero reserve forces, attempting to hold the town would just result in another massacre.
So they retreated.
The vital ground of Tawang had to be abandoned to save the remnants of the military forces from total encirclement.
If we are building an analytical anchor here for understanding the higher direction of war, this is the textbook example of strategic overextension.
Perfect example.
You never, ever abandon your primary defensible objective to push your forces into an indefensible forward posture. Because when that brittle, overextended forward line shatters, you have traded your fortress for a riverbank, and you have nothing left to fall back on.
Precisely. The loss of Tawang was a devastating psychological blow, not just to the military, but to the entire Indian nation. It shattered the illusion of border security.
It woke everybody up.
And it forced the remnants of the Indian army into a desperate retreat, setting the stage for the most complex and disastrous maneuver of the war, the Se and Bomdila debacle.
Okay, let's walk through the mechanics of this phase. The Indian forces fall back from Tawang, retreating deeper into their own territory, and they decide to make a stand at the Se Pass.
Right.
Now, when I look at the topographical sources, Selah looks like an absolute impregnable fortress.
Oh, it is.
We're talking about a mountain pass characterized by incredibly steep, sheer slopes at great altitude. It offers magnificent sweeping fields of fire for artillery and machine guns.
You can see everything coming.
Exactly. It has extensive flat dropping zones for aerial resupply, and it even has access to fresh water from 2 high-altitude lakes.
It's perfect.
It was designed geographically to hold out through the entire winter, with the assumption that the heavy snows would eventually freeze and snap the Chinese supply lines stretching back to Tibet.
That was the hope.
So, from a purely physical standpoint, how does an impenetrable position like Selah collapse?
Because the physical strength of a mountain is entirely irrelevant if the command decisions governing it are weak, and if the operational cohesion of the force is fractured.
So the geography didn't fail them, the leadership did.
This is the ultimate lesson of the Nepha Theater. Let's examine the deployment geometry. The Indian 4 Infantry Division, now under intense pressure to halt the Chinese advance, decided to adopt a fortress defense strategy.
Okay.
But rather than concentrating their combat power into a single, mutually supporting, heavily fortified zone, they dispersed their forces over an agonizingly massive distance.
They split the division into 3 separate chunks, right?
Right.
They placed the 62 Brigade forward of the Sala Pass. Then way back down the winding mountain road, they placed the 65 Brigade and the division headquarters at a town called Durangzong.
Yes.
And then even further back toward the plains, they stationed the 48 Brigade at Bomdila.
They spread a single infantry division along 60 miles of twisting, vulnerable mountain roads.
60 miles.
They created 3 isolated islands of defense, connected only by a fragile ribbon of tarmac.
So they aren't mutually supporting at all.
Not even close. Now observe the Chinese operational response. The Chinese 11 Infantry Division executed a maneuver that military academies still study today for its audacity and sheer physical endurance.
What did they do?
They realized that a frontal assault up the steep slopes of Selah would be an absolute meat grinder.
Right, the fortress.
So they decided to ignore the fortress entirely. They gathered roughly 10,000 troops and executed a 160-kilometer outflanking maneuver.
160 kilometers.
Ah.
Through the uncharted Himalayas.
Along a forgotten, incredibly treacherous local track known as the Bailey Trail.
Stop and think about the logistics of that. We're talking about moving a forest the size of a small city over a goat path.
The physical discipline required is astounding. This maneuver took 6 days and 7 nights of continuous marching.
Day and night.
They moved primarily under the cover of darkness to avoid detection by Indian aerial reconnaissance, hiding in the dense forests during the day.
And what were they carrying?
Every single Chinese soldier carried 30 kilograms of provisions, ammunition, and weaponry on their backs. They were supported by a logistical train of over 1,000 locally recruited porters carrying heavy mortars and machine guns.
It is like water finding the microscopic cracks in a concrete dam.
That's a perfect way to describe it.
They didn't hammer against the reinforced spillway of Selah. They found the fault lines in the mountains and just slipped through.
Exactly. And on the night of November 17th, this massive phantom force emerged from the mountains and violently severed the main road between Durangzong and Bomdila.
They cut the ribbon. They sliced the Indian 4 Division perfectly in half, right behind their main fortress at Selah.
They snapped the waist, executing Marshal Liu Bosheng's anatomical strategy flawlessly.
And this is when the panic sets in.
And this is the moment where the Indian command structure simply vaporizes into panic. You have to remember, the 62 Brigade up at Selah was fully stocked.
They had supplies.
They had rations, ammunition, and strong bunkers. They could have held out for weeks, potentially tying down massive Chinese resources.
So they were safe in their fortress.
But when news broke that the road behind them had been cut, the division commander located down at Durangzong, Major General A.S. Pathenia, succumbed to total psychological paralysis.
He broke.
He believed his headquarters was about to be overrun, and he frantically sought permission to abandon his position and withdraw.
And what does the higher command do? I mean, you still have General Call trying to pull strings. You have the army chief in Delhi. You have the Eastern Command in Lucknow. Surely someone steps in and says, hold your ground. You are a fortress.
You'd think so. Instead, you get a master class in buck passing and command confusion.
No one wanted to make the call.
Orders to withdraw are tentatively approved, then suddenly canceled, then partially transmitted over failing radio links.
Chaos.
Complete chaos. Up at Selah, Brigadier Hosher Singh is trying to maintain his defense. But due to the panic directives filtering up from below, he receives an order to pull one of his forward battalions back from a highly prepared, critical defensive position to supposedly protect the retreat route.
If you are an infantryman sitting in a trench and you suddenly see an entire battalion of your own side abandoning their bunkers and marching toward the rear, the psychological impact is catastrophic.
It induces immediate contagious panic.
Of course it does.
The troops who are left behind see the withdrawal and assume the defense has failed, that a general rout is underway. To compound the disaster, the Chinese forces who had been quietly encircling the Silla Pass immediately noticed the movement.
They saw them leaving.
They surged forward, occupied the freshly vacated Indian bunkers, and began pouring heavy machine gun fire directly into the flanks of the remaining Indian defenders.
It turns a planned repositioning into a slaughter.
By the morning of November 18th, the 62 Brigade, which had the terrain and the supplies to inflict massive casualties on the enemy, was in a disorganized, chaotic flight from Silla without ever having fought a cohesive brigade-level defensive battle.
The fortress fell from the inside out.
It did, and the panic just cascades down the mountain.
What about Durangzong?
General Pathenia at Durangzong doesn't mount a defense. He abandons his headquarters and flees toward the plains with his staff, even though he had thousands of men under his command in the area who could have put up a fight.
He just left his men.
And General Cole, attempting to micromanage the crisis, orders troops out of the defensive perimeter at Bomdila to try and march up the road to clear the Chinese blockade.
Which leaves Bomdila exposed.
Which simply opens the gates of Bomdila for the Chinese to walk into an ambush. The entire 4 Infantry Division disintegrated as a cohesive fighting force within 48 hours.
48 hours for a whole division.
The casualty figures reflect the one-sided nature of the rout. The Indian forces suffered over 5,100 casualties, killed, wounded, and captured. The Chinese forces, conducting an incredibly complex offensive operation over brutal terrain, suffered fewer than 800 casualties.
It is a devastating collapse.
It
But just like at Namka Chu, amidst the high-level panic and the fleeing generals, there are these intense, blinding flashes of tactical courage by the officers who refuse to break.
Yes.
I want to highlight the last stand at Leghorn.
It is essential to include the story of Lieutenant Colonel Brahmananda Vasi and the 4 Rajput to understand the full spectrum of the Indian soldiers' experience in 1962.
Avasti was widely considered one of the finest, most capable combat officers in the Indian Army.
A true leader.
He was assigned to command the 4 Rajput Regiment, which, due to the chaos of the shifting orders, was being moved around piecemeal during the retreat.
Right, they were just getting shuffled around.
While the bulk of 62 Brigade was falling back from Silla in total disarray, abandoning weapons and scattering into the jungles, Avasti and his men took up a blocking position at a crucial bridge to allow the fleeing stragglers to escape.
They covered the retreat.
They held that bridge as long as possible, fighting off probing Chinese attacks. When it became clear that no more units were coming down the road, Avasti finally pulled his men back. But they didn't scatter.
They stayed together.
They maintained their discipline. They carried their wounded with them, including a regimental doctor who had gone completely snowblind from the glare of the glaciers.
They were attempting to navigate a path back to the plains through the dense forests, absorbing lost and wandering soldiers from other shattered units along the way.
Right.
They plotted a route that took them toward an ancient, isolated monastery called Leghorn.
But the Chinese had already anticipated the retreat routes.
They were waiting.
They had outflanked the retreating columns. As Avasti's exhausted column approached the clearing near the monastery, they walked directly into a massive ambush prepared by a 500-strong Chinese assault unit.
Completely surrounded.
But put yourself in Avasti's boots. You are outnumbered, your men are freezing, starving, and carrying wounded. The division has collapsed. He could have ordered his men to scatter into the dense jungle and try to save themselves individually.
Many would have done that.
But what did he do?
He chose the hardest path of military leadership. He chose to fight an unwinnable battle to inflict maximum damage on the enemy.
He attacked.
Despite lacking heavy weapons or artillery support, Avasti did not just form a defensive perimeter. He actively organized his men and launched a desperate, two-pronged counterattack directly into the teeth of the Chinese ambush.
The battle raged for hours in the shadow of the monastery. It eventually devolved into brutal hand-to-hand combat in the dirt. Avasti's men formed a perimeter around him and fought to the absolute bitter end. Over 200 Indian soldiers were killed or severely wounded in that engagement, effectively a 100% casualty rate for that specific column.
No one walked away.
Colonel Avesty died fighting alongside his men. The defense was so incredibly fierce and the bravery so undeniable that the Chinese troops, who usually strip the dead of useful gear, actually dug a mass grave for the fallen Rajputs.
That shows immense respect.
They laid them to rest with military honors, and they flattened a metal ration tin, etching the names of the Indian officers into it to mark the site.
Wow.
When Avesti's body was finally recovered by Indian search teams long after the ceasefire, they found a blood-soaked, unsent letter to his wife folded in his pocket.
Leghorn perfectly encapsulates the brutal duality of the 1962 war. On the ground, you had junior officers and Jawans willing to fight and die with incredible ferocity, maintaining their honor in impossible conditions.
But they were let down by the system.
Utterly betrayed by a systemic failure of national preparation, non-existent logistics, and a higher command structure that collapsed at the first sign of friction.
Which brings us to the sudden, jarring end of this module's timeline. On November 20th, having completely shattered the Indian defensive architecture in Nefa, having pushed right to the edge of the Assam plains, and realizing their own supply lines back to Tibet were now stretched to the absolute breaking point as winter set in, the PLA made a calculated geopolitical move.
A very strategic choice.
They declared a unilateral ceasefire and began withdrawing back to their pre-war positions behind the McMahon Line.
They didn't need to hold the territory south of the line. They had already achieved their primary political and strategic objectives. They had thoroughly humiliated the Indian military establishment on the global stage.
They made their point.
They had secured their vital territorial claims in the western sector of Ladakh, which we will cover, and they had brutally forced India to the negotiating table on Chinese terms, completely destroying the premise of the forward policy.
It is a phenomenal amount of historical, tactical, and emotional data to process. I want to thank you, the listener, for staying engaged with us through this incredibly intense analytical session. Before you step away, let's lock down the architecture of what we've covered. Expert, give us the 5-minute battlefield recall.
Let's trace the dominoes of operational failure one last time.
Yeah.
Anchor 1. Force imbalance.
Right.
We saw a plains-oriented, politically directed Indian army pushed into the freezing, high-altitude mountains with cotton uniforms and World War II rifles, completely outmatched by climatized, road-supplied PLA veterans wielding automatic weapons.
Anchor 2.
Anchor 2. Operation Leghorn. The disastrous political mandate to evict the Chinese from Thagla, resulting in the assignment of a geographically and mathematically impossible mission to the 7th Infantry Brigade, stripping them of their logistical base.
And Anchor 3.
Anchor 3. The Battle of Namka Chu. The fatal decision to deploy troops in the valley floor moat rather than the high ground, leading to a textbook Chinese envelopment and the total annihilation of the 7th Brigade by forces attacking from the heights.
Then Anchor 4.
Anchor 4. The Fall of Tawang. The cascading consequence of overextension. A vital, culturally significant defensive stronghold falling without a fight because its defenders had been pushed 100 kilometers too far forward.
And finally, Anchor 5.
Anchor 5. The Silla and Bomdila debacle. The ultimate proof that the physical strength of a natural fortress cannot compensate for command panic. A 60-mile dispersed defense broken by a brilliant Chinese outflanking maneuver over a goat path, leading to the total disintegration of the 4th Infantry Division.
Excellent. And to synthesize this history, here are the top 10 keywords, the vocabulary of the disaster that you need to carry forward in your analysis. Forward policy.
Operation Leghorn.
Namka Chu.
Thagla Ridge.
4 Infantry Division.
7th Infantry Brigade.
Logistics failure.
Positional warfare.
Outflanking maneuver.
Higher direction of war.
Master how those 10 concepts interlock. How politics drove positional warfare, which drove logistics failure, culminating in an outflanking maneuver, and you will possess a rigorous understanding of the operational collapse in Nefa.
The next module continues the battlefield analysis across remaining sectors, studying Wolong, Western Sector operations, Chushul, and Razongla, where preparation, leadership, and fighting spirit produce different outcomes.
So as you step away from the study table today, I want you to think back to those cotton uniforms and those 50 rounds of ammunition. We spend so much time studying the enemy across the border. We study their tactics, their weapons, their supply lines. But the darkest lesson of 1962 isn't about the power of the Chinese army.
No, it's not.
The question of internal mechanics. What happens when a nation's greatest operational threat isn't the enemy massing on the ridge, but the hubris, the bureaucracy, and the delusions echoing inside its own capital? Keep digging. We'll see you in Module 3.